glad you're joining us today because I'm excited to finish up a series that we've been in for the last few weeks. And so whether you're here in person or watching on Facebook right now or maybe sometime later, I'm excited and hopeful that today's message about finishing up Follow will kind of push us to go a little bit further. Because we've looked at what it means to be a follower of Jesus versus being a fan. We've looked at the things that hold us back from fully following. And we've also looked at how as individuals we can follow or we can follow better. But today we're going to look at the church. What would the church look like if the church was made up of more followers of Jesus than fans of Jesus? So we'll start with this. If I asked you, did you hear about what happened at, blank, fill in the blank church? Where does your mind go when you hear that? Right? Well, unfortunately, when we hear questions that start out like this, we immediately start to think of something bad. What happened? Right? And it's hard to find fault with anyone who thinks like this because when the church has made the news or has been in headlines, it's usually been because of something negative or there's some scandal that's happening. And I want to be clear, when this happens, it's no one's fault but our own, right? It's no one's fault but the church. The church isn't being picked on, but instead the church, or the church in question, is having a problem because it's not living up to who the church was called to be. It's not really practicing what it means to follow in the way of Jesus, or we're falling short of that calling. And if you were just to base your ideas of church and have these ideas of what, the capital C, global church, what happens, if you just based it off those headlines, you'd think that there's not a lot going on for the church, right? Or at least the American church. And I think it's important we make that distinction because we speak to what we know. Right? And we know the American church. That's where we live. That's what we're a part of. And so that's what we speak to, the church in America. But in spite of the bad that happens, in spite of all the attention that it grabs, there's also a lot of good happening in the church as well. So here's some good news. In February, a church in Ohio announced that in partnership with an organization called RIP Medical Debt, they helped pay off over $46 million in medical debt for 45,000 families. And additional churches and other organizations, they're also a part of this, and they're coming alongside this movement of helping ease the burden of medical expenses for families in need, families who either need procedures or have gotten procedures but can't afford to pay them back. And then when COVID-19 hit, right, churches all across the country spread into action, right, in tangible ways. Right? They set up food pantries, or maybe they helped supply groceries, helped pay a month's rent or two. And in some cases, some churches who had enough space and enough area, they donated their space to become testing centers for COVID-19. And then in the midst of racial reckonings and protests, churches, they've been places where conversations have been able to take place, right? And these conversations, they're not happening as political issues. They're not setting up to be debates, but rather it's been a conversation about life issues, right? Life issues in the context of relationship with one another. And then locally, we've seen communities come together to support one another through that flooding that happened last September, to the feelings of isolation and loneliness that happened when we all were staying at home and separated. And then we've been able to figure out what it means to be together, even when we can't physically. Churches and their communities, they are taking the lead, right? They're helping lead, being a voice in their communities in all kinds of areas. And that's a really good thing. That's part of who the church is called to be. And it's not just Christians, or it's not just people who are in the church or who are a part of the church that are saying that, but rather a recent survey published in late July by Barna Group. And Barna is this organization that does a lot of religious surveys and statistics about the church and opinions of the church. But a recent survey they published in late July said that 1 in 4 Americans, Not 1 in 4 Christians, not 1 in 4 people who go to church, but 1 in 4 of the general population said the church should lead in solving local problems. 1 in 4 said the church should lead in solving local problems. And now the visions of what that looks like and in different contexts, it might vary. Right? Nobody's going to have the same idea about how the church leads. But nonetheless, 1 in 4 people see the church as being a key leader in our local communities. And so as people in the church, people who are part of the church, people who are actively seeking to follow Jesus, how do we respond to this then? What do we say to this idea that 1 in 4 say the local church should be leading in local problems? Well, first off, I think it's interesting that 1 in 4 of Americans think the church should lead, but I also think it's interesting that 3 in 4 then are saying that the church isn't leading. Right? We have to look at why do 3 in 4 people say that the church shouldn't be leading? Especially in a country where 65% of all adults identify as Christians. 65% of adults in America identify as Christians, but only 25% think that the church should lead. Well, the problem here is that there is a disconnect from what the people know that church should be, the global church, capital C church, church in America should be, and what it can be, has been different from their experiences with Christians or in a church. Too often, too many people have had their experiences with Christians in the church shaped by fans of Jesus rather than by followers of Jesus. If you talk with someone who isn't inside the church, and maybe they grew up in the church and left, or maybe going to church has never been on their radar at all. It's not their lane. But if you ask them about the church and about Christians, you might begin to hear words like judgmental, hypocritical, hurtful, or a list of all the issues and topics that they perceive the church to be against. Right? And more common than not, these experiences and these perceptions, they've been shaped by people living much more like fans of Jesus than living like followers of Jesus. And if we as people, as part of the capital C church, are to do anything to change this, and not just to change it so that people think well of us or people think we're nice or to increase our PR as Christians. No, but if we want to change because we desire to see the world transformed, to be messengers of the good news of the coming kingdom, of the gospel, to actually work towards on earth as it is in heaven. If we're to change that, we have to lead with love. We have to lead with love. And it's the love that Jesus talks about in John chapter 13. And so we're in John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35 today. And Jesus says, "Let me give you a new command. Love one another. In the same way that I've loved you, you love one another. This is how everyone will recognize that you are my disciples, when they see the love that you have for each other." So in the scripture today, we come to another point where Jesus is having one of those intimate conversations between himself and the disciples. Right? But this conversation, it's not just a one-off, and this isn't the whole conversation, but rather this is happening in part of a larger context. Okay? We're hearing just a small part. Because what happened before this is that Jesus had just ate what would be the Last Supper with his disciples. Judas has already left. He's already set in motion the betrayal. Jesus has literal hours left before he's going to face the cross. And in John's gospel, in this small time frame, from the end of chapter 13 all the way through the end of chapter 17, all of those chapters focus on this time frame and how Jesus is giving his final instructions, his departing words to the disciples. And Jesus starts these instructions off with our scripture today. I give you a new commandment. Jesus tells them, love one another in the same way that I have loved you. This is how people will recognize that you are my disciples. And the love that Jesus speaks of here, it's not the warm, fuzzy feelings all the time kind of love, right? It's important to say that. It's not always feeling great about each other all the time, but rather the love that Jesus speaks of here is called agape love. It's unconditional love. The love Jesus is speaking of is self-sacrificial love. Take care of each other. Help those who are in need. Okay? Build each other up. Work for the good of everyone, regardless of who they are, regardless of all that they might think differently about, and even in all of their flaws, love one another unconditionally. Love that's willing to be humble, right? To take the lowest place in a setting instead of having to be at the place of honor. Right? Love that washes feet. Love for those who are forgotten, who are different than you are. Love because each person is an image bearer of the Father. Love that shows that you are Jesus' disciple. And when we say to be a disciple of Jesus, it means that we're to be a learner and a student of his ways, of his teachings. And so what Jesus has essentially told the disciples with this command of love, that if you're going to follow in my ways, above all else, above everything you do, you have to lead with love. You have to love one another. You must love like I love, and it should be recognizable. There should be no guessing, but it should be recognizable love. It should be a way of life, not a decision you make that just happens one day, but rather it's a decision every day, a way of life, a way to live. It should be where everything in our lives flow from. Love has to lead. It brings us out of our relationships and our closed bubbles and circles, right? And it brings us into the relationship with other people. And when we start with love, it opens doors. It makes possibilities. It's why Jesus, he talks so much about love here, and then he comes back to love at the end of chapter 17, this idea of his love, agape love, when he's praying for his disciples. As Jesus is getting ready to start this walk, at the end he says, let me pray for you. Let me pray that you might love each other. And so this is where we pick back up then in chapter 17, verses 20 through 23. And it's in the middle of this prayer, Jesus says, I'm praying not only for them, but also for those who will believe in me because of them and their witness about me. The goal is for all of them to become one heart and mind, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, so they might be one heart and mind with us. Then the world might believe that you, in fact, sent me. And this is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So as Jesus prays, and we find him in this prayer, he prays for the disciples and their witness. He prays for their lives, right? And he's saying that the lives that his disciples will live, the lives that they'll continue to lead, they will matter. What you do matters. And he says when there's love for one another, it's going to make it possible for them, for the church, to be of one heart, to be of one mind. Because when there's this love that's there, love values relationship. Love values people, right? It doesn't mean that everyone's always going to get along, everyone's always going to think the same, right? It doesn't mean we'll all be in agreement, but rather, if there's love, it allows for healthy disagreement, right? When there's disagreements, that arise. Every argument's not some battle that has to be won. But rather, at the end of the day, we can put aside our differences, or we can at least agree to disagree, because we know that we value each other. Above all else, this love says that this relationship is the most important. And when we do this, when we as followers of Jesus are able to do this, that's what leads to what we call maturity in oneness. It's a maturity in oneness that Jesus goes on to speak of. It allows us to lead effectively in the world when we can have this maturity in oneness. It shows that we believe that with Jesus, a new way has been made possible, because we believe that evil and sin and death have all been defeated, and that there's this new way forward, that this new way of following in the steps of Jesus, leading in love. And so what would it look like for us today? What would it look like for the church if people were willing to follow Jesus' command of love? Not just sometimes, not just when it's easy, but also when it's hard. Right? What would it look like if we were mature in oneness of love? Imagine the possibilities. Right? I like to think that there'd be a lot less anger among us. There'd be a lot less animosity because someone doesn't agree with us or doesn't think about things the way that we think about them. I think we'd be able to talk about areas where we do disagree, because we wouldn't take it as a personal insult that someone views something a different way. And maybe, just maybe, we'd begin to stop viewing our lives through the lens that for me to be right, there has to be a winner. And if it's not my way, it's wrong. And that's a losing idea. Right? If we lead with love, we don't have to look at the world through that lens. Because we'd see before anything else, people are people. People are people. And we might choose to be in unity, even if we disagree at times, instead of division. If that was our mindset, to love first, to be unified in love for one another, if that was the case, would we hear more about the church leading in our communities? Would we hear more stories about churches and people helping to lift the burdens of debt? And then what would it look like if, as followers of Jesus, we weren't just united in relief, but rather we were united in the elimination, the eradication of things like poverty, hunger, addiction, abuse, etc.? What would that look like? At times we tend to look past these issues, right, and view them just as that, to view them just as issues. But if we're unified in love, right, if we're unified in love, loving as Jesus loves, it reminds us that these issues that we talk about, they do affect people. They affect real, living, breathing people every day. This is who Jesus called us to be. Right? This is who he calls the church to be. This is where we follow. We follow to live a life of love in action, caring for and loving others as Jesus did. And if we can follow Jesus in this way of love, right, in maturity and oneness, we might begin to see the world a different way, the way it was created to be. And so usually when we get to the end of a message, we usually end with some kind of challenge or response, a way that we can take with us where we can tangibly live out the ideas that we've discussed. But today instead, rather as we close, you're going to hear from Andrew Devaney. He's the CEO and founder of As One Ministries. And As One, if you've been following along the past few weeks, you know that As One works in Uganda in two communities that are on opposite sides of the country. Namayemba is on the very eastern side, right next to Kenya, and then Rwanda-Bihuka is over on the western side. And As One works with local leaders in both of these communities in the areas of business, education, agriculture, and the local church. And so Andrew and I, we sat down for a conversation a couple days ago to get an update on the Scholars Program and just As One in general. And as a church at Unite, we're grateful to partner with an organization like As One, who's following in the way of Jesus by loving as Jesus loved. And this love, what it does is it helps empower local leaders. It empowers local leaders to create sustainable solutions for their communities and their loved ones. So here's our conversation between Andrew and myself. Well, hey, everyone. You said we were going to have a conversation with Andrew, who's the CEO and founder of As One Ministries. You've heard about As One over the past few weeks, specifically with their Scholars Program. But today when we talk with Andrew, we're going to learn a little bit more about As One in general, as well as the Scholars Program. But first, we want to go down this idea of what we've been talking about, specifically in the last 4 weeks, where we've looked at, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? What does it mean to look at our lives as, being followers? And what does that look like day to day? And I thought it might be nice just to hear from Andrew about not only, where did As One come from and what was your heart behind that, but even looking at our scripture that we use today in John 17, going after oneness and choosing unity over division and having a heart to be together, to desire to be as one. So I don't know where you want to start off down that road, but maybe give us a little bit of your story.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks, Jordan. Thanks for the nice intro, and good to be with you. I'm Andrew. Work with As One, and I think that's a great way to tee this off. I remember sort of getting towards the end of my time in college. I'd spent one summer living over in East Africa and was getting ready to kind of prepare for a second time of doing that. And I remember hearing a quote, and I think it was from Dallas Willard, that said something along the lines of, many of us want to be like Jesus, but very few of us want to adopt the lifestyle of Jesus. So we want the life that Jesus has to offer, but we're very unwilling to adopt the very lifestyle that Jesus had. Yeah. A lifestyle that oftentimes, you look at his predominant teaching in the Gospels on the Sermon on the Mount, and one that is very willing to disadvantage him or herself for the blessing and the betterment of others, and it's one who's willing to take a totally opposite path of winning, which looks more like losing, and a teaching that lifts up those who have suffered and struggled and been brokenhearted, and those who mourn with those who mourn. And I felt kind of a disconnect in my own journey with Jesus, that I wanted so badly this abundant life in the Greek is zoe, that Jesus came to offer, but I felt like very little of my lifestyle looked anything like Jesus's. And it's really easy as a college kid to want to go over to Africa and be able to have this it's an easy place to kind of learn to adopt that lifestyle, but there was something about it that very much challenged me in putting yourself in front of the people that Jesus always was putting himself in front of, that weren't anything like him. Yeah. So go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, keep going into that. Tell us, how did you wrestle with those ideas, and how did you process all of that?
Yeah. Well, it was easier when I was in college to try to live into it than it is as I'm getting older and becoming an adult. I just think that the status quo and the easy route and the route that makes sense and the route that is clearly marked out for winning is a very easy path to take. Whether that's success in our careers, or whether that is, I don't know, just what's comfortable in our families. And I feel as if when we're looking to live into that abundant life, we're looking to live into the deep love of God. We're kind of set out on a journey where we're living somewhere at the margins. We're not living on the path that it appears to be the one that makes sense. And so I think as I've tried to mature, one one of the things that was really like easy for me when I was younger was to like want to jump in and solve this great vast problem of poverty, and want to walk alongside people who suffered and struggled. One, because it kind of felt good for me, like
Yep.
it felt really rewarding. But then as I've kind of done it longer, it's gotten harder and it's become more mundane, and change is harder. And the people that you're trying to serve, you find them actually like cheating you.
Yeah.
And you find them, you find it to continue to become increasingly inconvenient. And, I've found even kind of in the last 5 years of As One to have, at times I get jaded and I've been really hurt. And I feel like there's so many easy things or things that I could do that would be much easier on my life.
Yeah.
But I have experienced that, like the invitation of God's grace and the very like challenge of the message of the gospel is that like, but we kind of continue to put ourselves in places that disadvantage. I mean, look at Jesus. He like obviously died on a cross. So for us, it's like we continually put ourselves where like the thumb, when it's pressed down, it hurts and it's hard. And I actually think that is where like the very life of faith and a deep life of communion and dependence on God begins to be formed. And so I don't know if that answered your question, but that's been a little bit of my journey.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting just how you were talking about as you get into a relationship. You talked a little bit about suffering. And one idea or place that we went with is that we've talked about suffering a couple weeks ago, and just how this idea of being in a relationship with those who are disadvantaged or disenfranchised, it not only puts us in a posture of serving and humbling ourselves, but it also allows us to maybe see places in our lives that we've been blind to about where we've been suffering. And has that contributed at all to your development?
Oh, yeah. So that's great. And I think part of the journey of like love and learning to be more loving and just from a positional and postural standpoint, it's all of, I found so much of that in interacting with people who are just fundamentally different than me. And it's so easy as an American and a white person and an outsider to go into a place that everything looks like it shouldn't, according to our way of seeing the world.
Yeah.
And to want to like fix it and to want to put it together. And the real hard work of my time that I've spent in Africa, particularly Uganda, has been actually like letting myself be exposed, letting my selfishness, my need to control, my thoughts that like this is what a better life looks like, and wanting to recreate people and their life and their lifestyle to reflect one that looks more like mine.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think that the real process of transformation is beginning to recognize where we aren't whole, and beginning to recognize where we actually miss the mark. That though like my friends, my brothers and sisters in Uganda may have material poverty, which I believe like mars and destroys their dignity at times as people, they also are abundant and spiritually rich and relationally rich and joyful. And like when I talk to them about depression and anxiety and stress and all the different things that I hold, they look at me like I'm crazy. And so there is a real balance in that, and it has been very challenging to me, especially challenging how easy it is when I feel like I'm in a pinch or in a crunch, particularly like a financial one, how often I want to like manipulate the situation, and how I learn from like my friends over in East Africa, like what true dependence on God looks like.
Yeah.
And people who truly trust Him for everything that they have. That has been a real challenge to me.
Yeah, definitely. Good to hear. I guess now moving more into specifically like what's happening this year. 2020 has affected everyone around the globe. And so for a place like Uganda, and specifically in the communities of Namayemba and Rwanya-Bihuka, how have those communities been affected? Because even what the COVID effect looks like here, in Salem and South Dakota, in the United States, is going to be very different from Uganda.
Yeah, so Uganda locked down real early. I think by the time they got their first or second case,
Okay.
they did a nationwide lockdown. And what a nationwide lockdown looks like is like they closed the airport, grounded all planes, they shut down the borders. They did a stay-at-home order. The stay-at-home order was that if you get caught walking around leaving your home, you'll be arrested. So it was very, very strict.
Yeah.
So all economic activity completely suppressed, which was brutal for people. The majority of folks who live in rural communities like Namayamba and Ranyabihuka, they would be kind of these, what they would either call like a subsistence farmer or a day laborer. And so what they make that day is what they spend that night for dinner. And then to eat that night, the next night, they go and work again. And so the big fear, and this was even particularly harder in urban areas where it was easier to be enforced, but the big fear was that people weren't going to eat. They weren't going to have any means to eat. And so, yeah, that was predominantly the fear. So we actually worked with the government to kind of figure out a few programs, being one of the main agencies in both the areas that we work. And there's one thing we called it a Push the Week program. There's a local vegetable there called sukuma wiki.
Okay.
It literally means push the week, and it grows really quite fast. 2 to 3 weeks you're able to grow this crop. And it's kind of equivalent to like a spinach, kale.
Okay, there we go.
And so we provided seed and packets on how to plant and grow sukuma wiki, and that was to help people push the week. And then so that was about 300 to 500 people that received the benefits of that. And then for another 1,000 families, which is about 5,000 to 6,000 people, we provided these food packages that had about 2.5 weeks of food in there, which was able to help them kind of pass through the duration of the initial lockdown, which was about 30 days.
Okay.
People were locked down. But to date, schools are still locked down, churches don't meet, airports closed, borders are closed. Supposedly going to reopen here early October. But, yeah, I mean, it's, statistics say there's about 20 million kids out of school right now that are just at home waiting, don't have anything to do. Another 2 to 2.5 million people who dropped back below, new people added to being below that poverty line index. So, that could be the folks, that could be, over the last 5 years, the people who climbed out of poverty in Uganda that are falling back into it, which is, it's been devastating economically. But from a health standpoint, very few cases and less than 50 recorded deaths.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right. Yeah. Wow. You talked about teachers becoming social workers and making these visits. One of the things that we've highlighted about the Scholars Program is that it doesn't just focus on school. I mean, it provides an opportunity for an education, but there's also spiritual development opportunities for these students and relational opportunities. How does that look now, or maybe because of COVID-19 it maybe doesn't look like that?
Yeah.
How's that going?
Yeah, so, I mean, the reality is that poverty is a very multifaceted, multidimensional problem, and it's not just a material problem. It's not just an emotional problem. It's not just a spiritual problem. It's not just an intellectual problem. It's very, very multifaceted, and so we realize that. And everything that As One does, we very much work to take a holistic approach to what we do. And so, students, as well as getting educational materials, they're having, these social workers follow up at their homes and to see how the family's doing. And some of those are the very families that receive food packets. Those are some of the very families that received these, seed packets. Some of these are the families whose parents jump into our farmer training school. So it's a very, we're creating a very interconnected, web of relationships that ensure that families aren't just going to fall through the cracks, to ensure that, and like all of us have, as we're making one step forward, we tend to fall back a half step. If we're making 2 steps forward, we fall 1 step back. And so we want to make sure that people don't fall back into the cracks. and trapped in these cycles of poverty, dependency, things like that. And so our goal is to really lift the whole family, the whole person, out of these situations. So by just providing, that runway, that opportunity to allow them to really take initiative and be able to do it themselves too.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Andrew, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for having this conversation.
Sorry if it was too long.
Yeah, that's all right. But 2020, we say it so many times, but it has been a weird year, to say the least. But we're looking forward to continuing to partner with you and with As One, and hopefully, when this is all over with, we can have you back at Unite in Salem, and maybe see Henry again, or get to meet some of the other Ugandan staff that's working with you guys.
Totally.
Come this time next year. So
Would love that. Well, good to be with you all,
Yeah.
and thanks, Jordan. And may God's grace and peace be on you guys.
all right, thanks, Andrew.